Bushido, the Soul of Japan. By Inazo Nitobe. Dedication to my beloved uncle Tokatoshi Ota, who taught me to revere the past and to admire the deeds of the samurai. I dedicate this little book. How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content. Preface to the first edition. About 10 years ago, while spending a few days under the hospitable roof of the distinguished Belgian jurist, the lamented M. de Laveley, our conversation turned during one of our rambles to the subject of religion. "Do you mean to say," asked the venerable professor, "that you have no religious instruction in your schools?" On my replying in the negative, he suddenly halted in astonishment, and in a voice which I shall not easily forget, he repeated, "No religion. How do you impart moral education?" The question stunned me at the time. I could give no ready answer, for the moral precepts I learned in my childhood days were not given in schools. And not until I began to analyze the different elements that formed my notions of right and wrong, did I find that it was Bushido that breathed them into my nostrils. The direct inception of this little book is due to the frequent queries put by my wife as to the reasons why such and such ideas and customs prevail in Japan. In my attempts to give satisfactory replies to M. de Laveley and to my wife, I found that without understanding feudalism and Bushido, the moral ideas of present Japan are a sealed volume. Taking advantage of enforced idleness on account of long illness, I put down in the order now presented to the public some of the answers given in our household conversation. They consist mainly of what I was taught and told in my youthful days, when feudalism was still in force. Between Lafcadio Hearn and Mrs. Hugh Fraser on one side and Sir Ernest Sato and Professor Chamberlain on the other, it is indeed discouraging to write anything Japanese in English. The only advantage I have over them is that I can assume the attitude of a personal defendant, while these distinguished writers are at best solicitors and attorneys. I have often thought had I their gift of language, I would present the cause of Japan in more eloquent terms. But one who speaks in a borrowed tongue should be thankful if he can just make himself intelligible. All through the discourse I have tried to illustrate whatever points I have made with parallel examples from European history and literature, believing that these will aid in bringing the subject nearer to the comprehension of foreign readers. Should any of my allusions to religious subjects and to religious workers be thought slighting, I trust my attitude toward Christianity itself will not be questioned. It is with ecclesiastical methods and with the forms which obscure the teachings of Christ, and not with the teachings themselves, that I have little sympathy. I believe in the religion taught by him and handed down to us in the New Testament, as well as in the law written in the heart. Further, I believe that God hath made a testament which may be called old with every people and nation, Gentile or Jew, Christian or heathen. As to the rest of my theology, I need not impose upon the patience of the public. In concluding this preface, I wish to express my thanks to my friend Anna C. Hartshome for many valuable suggestions. I.N. Introduction. At the request of his publishers, to whom Dr. Nitobe has left some freedom of action concerning prefatory matter, I am glad to offer a few sentences of introduction to this new edition of Bushido, for readers of English everywhere. I have been acquainted with the author for over 15 years, indeed, but, in a measure at least, with his subject during 45 years. It was in 1860, in Philadelphia, where, in 1847, I saw the Susquehanna, Commodore Perry's flagship launched, that I looked on my first Japanese and met members of the embassy from Yedo. I was mightily impressed with these strangers, to whom Bushido was a living code of ideals and manners. Later, during 3 years at Rutgers College, New Brunswick, N.J. I was among scores of young men from Nippon, whom I taught or knew as fellow students. I found that Bushido, about which we often talked, was a superbly winsome thing. As illustrated in the lives of these future governors, diplomatists, admirals, educators, and bankers, yes, even in the dying hours of more than one who fell on sleep in Willow Grove Cemetery. The perfume of this most fragrant flower of far-off Japan was very sweet. Never shall I forget how the dying samurai lad, Kyuzukabe, when invited to the noblest of services and the greatest of hopes, made answer, even if I could know your master, Jesus, I should not offer him only the dregs of a life. So, on the banks of the old Raritan, in athletic sports, in merry jokes at the supper table when contrasting things Japanese and Yankee, and in the discussion of ethics and ideals, I felt quite willing to take the covert missionary retort. About which my friend Charles Dudley Warner once wrote. At some points, codes of ethics and proprieties differed, but rather in dots or tangents than as occultation or eclipse. As their own poet wrote, was it 1,000 years ago? When in crossing a moor the dew-laden flowers brushed by his robe left their glittering drops on his brocade, on account of its perfume, I brush not this moisture from my sleeve. Indeed, I was glad to get out of ruts, which are said to differ from graves only by their length. For, is not comparison the life of science and culture? Is it not true that, in the study of languages, ethics, religions, and codes of manners, he who knows but one knows none? Called, in 1870, to Japan as pioneer educator to introduce the methods and spirit of the American public school system, how glad I was to leave the capital, and at Fukui, in the province of Echizen, see pure feudalism in operation. There I looked on Bushido, not as an exotic, but in its native soil. In daily life I realized that Bushido, with its chanoyu, jujutsu, jojitsu, harakiri, polite prostrations on the mats and genuflections on the street, rules of the sword and road, all leisurely salutations and politest molds of speech. Canons of art and conduct, as well as heroisms for wife, maid, and child, formed the universal creed and praxis of all the gentry in the castled city and province. In it, as a living school of thought and life, girl and boy alike were trained. What Dar Nitobe received as an inheritance, had breathed into his nostrils, and writes about so gracefully and forcibly, with such grasp, insight, and breadth of view, I saw. Japanese feudalism died without the sight of its ablest exponent and most convincing defender. To him it is as wafted fragrance. To me it was the plant and flower of light. Hence, living under and being in at the death of feudalism, the body of Bushido, I can bear witness to the essential truth of Dr. Nitobe's descriptions, so far as they go, and to the faithfulness of his analysis and generalizations. He has limned with masterly art and reproduced the coloring of the picture which 1,000 years of Japanese literature reflects so gloriously. The knightly code grew up during a millennium of evolution, and our author lovingly notes the blooms that have starred the path trodden by millions of noble souls, his countrymen. Critical study has but deepened my own sense of the potency and value of Bushido to the nation. He who would understand 20th-century Japan must know something of its roots in the soil of the past. Even if now as invisible to the present generation in Nippon as to the alien, the philosophic student reads the results of today in the stored energies of ages gone. The sunbeams of unrecorded time have laid the strata out of which Japan now digs her foot-pounds of impact for war or peace. All the spiritual senses are keen in those nursed by Bushido. The crystalline lump has dissolved in the sweetened cup, but the delicacy of the flavor remains to cheer. In a word, Bushido has obeyed the higher law enunciated by one whom its own exponent salutes and confesses his master. Except a grain of corn die, it abideth alone, but if it die it bringeth forth much fruit. Has Dr. Nitobe idealized Bushido? Rather, we ask, how could he help doing so? He calls himself defendant. In all creeds, cults, and systems, while the ideal grows, exemplars and exponents vary. Gradual cumulation and slow attainment of harmony is the law. Bushido never reached a final goal. It was too much alive, and it died at last only in its splendor and strength. The clash of the world's movement, for so we name the rush of influences and events which followed Perry and Harris with feudalism in Japan, did not find Bushido an embalmed mummy, but a living soul. What it really met was the quickening spirit of humanity. Then the less was blessed of the greater. Without losing the best in her own history and civilization, Japan, following her own noble precedents, first adopted and then adapted the choicest the world had to offer. Thus her opportunity to bless Asia and the race became unique, and grandly she has embraced it, in diffusion ever more intense. Today, not only are our gardens, our art, our homes enriched by the flowers, the pictures, and the pretty things of Japan, whether trifles of a moment or triumphs for all time, but in physical culture, in public hygiene. In lessons for peace and war, Japan has come to us with her hands gift-laden. Not only in his discourse as advocate and counsel for the defense, but as prophet and wise householder, rich in things new and old, our author is able to teach us. No man in Japan has united the precepts and practice of his own Bushido more harmoniously in life and toil, labor and work, craft of hand and of pen, culture of the soil and of the soul. Illuminator of Dai Nippon's past, Dr. Nitobe is a true maker of the new Japan. In Formosa, the empire's new accretion, as in Kyoto, he is the scholar and practical man, at home in newest science and most ancient diligence. This little book on Bushido is more than a weighty message to the Anglo-Saxon nations. It is a notable contribution to the solution of this century's grandest problem, the reconciliation and unity of the East and the West. There were of old many civilizations, in the better world coming there will be one. Already the terms Orient and Occident, with all their freight of mutual ignorance and insolence, are ready to pass away. As the efficient middle term between the wisdom and communism of Asia and the energy and individualism of Europe and America, Japan is already working with resistless power. Instructed in things ancient and modern and cultured in the literatures of the world, Dr. Nitobe herein shows himself admirably fitted for a congenial task. He is a true interpreter and reconciler. He need not and does not apologize for his own attitude toward the master whom he has long loyally followed. What scholar, familiar with the ways of the spirit and with the history of the race as led by man's infinite friend, but must in all religions put difference between the teachings of the founder and the original documents and the ethnic, rationalistic, and ecclesiastical additions and accretions? The doctrine of the Testaments, hinted at in the author's preface, is the teaching of him who came not to destroy, but to fulfill. Even in Japan, Christianity, unwrapped from its foreign mold and matting, will cease being an exotic and strike its roots deep in the soil on which Bushido has grown. Stripped alike of its swaddling bands and its foreign regimentals, the church of the founder will be as native as the air. William Elliot Grippes. Ithaca, May, 1905. Epigrams. That way. Over the mountain, which who stands upon, is apt to doubt if it be indeed a road. While if he views it from the waste itself, up goes the line there, plain from base to brow. Not vague, mistakable. What's a break or two? Seen from the unbroken deserts either side? And then, to bring in fresh philosophy. What if the breaks themselves should prove at last the most consummate of contrivances? To train a man's eye, teach him what is faith. Robert Browning. Bishop Bluegram's Apology. There are, if I may so say, three powerful spirits, which have, from time to time, moved on the face of the waters, and given a predominant impulse to the moral sentiments and energies of mankind. These are the spirits of liberty, of religion, and of honor. Hallam. Europe in the Middle Ages. Chivalry is itself the poetry of life. Schlegel. Philosophy of History. Chapter 1. Bushido as an ethical system. Chivalry is a flower no less indigenous to the soil of Japan than its emblem, the cherry blossom, nor is it a dried-up specimen of an antique virtue preserved in the herbarium of our history. It is still a living object of power and beauty among us, and if it assumes no tangible shape or form, it not the less scents the moral atmosphere, and makes us aware that we are still under its potent spell. The conditions of society which brought it forth and nourished it have long disappeared. But as those far-off stars which once were and are not, still continue to shed their rays upon us, so the light of chivalry, which was a child of feudalism, still illuminates our moral path, surviving its mother institution. It is a pleasure to me to reflect upon this subject in the language of Burke, who uttered the well-known touching eulogy over the neglected beer of its European prototype. It argues a sad defect of information concerning the Far East, when so erudite a scholar as Dr. George Miller did not hesitate to affirm that, chivalry, or any other similar institution, has never existed either among the nations of antiquity or among the modern Orientals. To such ignorance, however, is amply excusable, as the third edition of The Good Doctors, work appeared the same year that Commodore Perry was knocking at the portals of our exclusivism. More than a decade later, about the time that our feudalism was in the last throes of existence, Karl Marx, writing his Capital, called the attention of his readers to the peculiar advantage of studying the social and political institutions of feudalism, as then to be seen in living form only in Japan. I would likewise point the Western historical and ethical student to the study of chivalry in the Japan of the present. Enticing as is an historical disquisition on the comparison between European and Japanese feudalism and chivalry, it is not the purpose of this paper to enter into it at length. My attempt is rather to relate firstly, the origin and sources of our chivalry, secondly, its character and teaching, thirdly, its influence among the masses, and, fourthly, the continuity and permanence of its influence. Of these several points, the first will be only brief and cursory, or else I should have to take my readers into the devious paths of our national history. The second will be dwelt upon at greater length, as being most likely to interest students of international ethics and comparative ethology in our ways of thought and action, and the rest will be dealt with as corollaries. The Japanese word which I have roughly rendered chivalry, is, in the original, more expressive than horsemanship. Bushido means literally military knight ways, the ways which fighting nobles should observe in their daily life as well as in their vocation, in a word, the precepts of knighthood, the noblesse oblige of the warrior class. Having thus given its literal significance, I may be allowed henceforth to use the word in the original. The use of the original term is also advisable for this reason, that a teaching so circumscribed and unique, engendering a cast of mind and character so peculiar, so local, must wear the badge of its singularity on its face. Then, some words have a national timbre so expressive of race characteristics that the best of translators can do them but scant justice, not to say positive injustice and grievance. Who can improve by translation what the German Gemüth signifies, or who does not feel the difference between the two words verbally so closely allied as the English gentleman and the French gentilhomme? Bushido, then, is the code of moral principles which the knights were required or instructed to observe. It is not a written code. At best it consists of a few maxims handed down from mouth to mouth or coming from the pen of some well-known warrior or savant. More frequently it is a code unuttered and unwritten, possessing all the more the powerful sanction of veritable deed, and of a law written on the fleshly tablets of the heart. It was founded not on the creation of one brain, however able, or on the life of a single personage, however renowned. It was an organic growth of decades and centuries of military career. It, perhaps, fills the same position in the history of ethics that the English Constitution does in political history, yet it has had nothing to compare with the Magna Carta or the Habeas Corpus Act. True, early in the 17th century military statutes, Bushido, were promulgated, but their 13 short articles were taken up mostly with marriages, castles, leagues, etc., and didactic regulations were but meagerly touched upon. We cannot, therefore, point out any definite time and place and say, here is its fountainhead. Only as it attains consciousness in the feudal age, its origin, in respect to time, may be identified with feudalism. But feudalism itself is woven of many threads, and Bushido shares its intricate nature. As in England the political institutions of feudalism may be said to date from the Norman conquest, so we may say that in Japan its rise was simultaneous with the ascendancy of Yoritomo, late in the 12th century. As, however, in England, we find the social elements of feudalism far back in the period previous to William the Conqueror, so, too, the germs of feudalism in Japan had been long existent before the period I have mentioned. Again, in Japan as in Europe, when feudalism was formally inaugurated, the professional class of warriors naturally came into prominence. These were known as samurai, meaning literally, like the Old English knight, connect, knight, guards, or attendants resembling in character the soldurii, whom Caesar mentioned as existing in Aquitania, or the comitati, who, according to Tacitus, followed Germanic chiefs in his time. Or, to take a still later parallel, the militas medii that one reads about in the history of medieval Europe. A Sinico-Japanese word buko or busher, fighting knights, was also adopted in common use. They were a privileged class, and must originally have been a rough breed who made fighting their vocation. This class was naturally recruited, in a long period of constant warfare, from the manliest and the most adventurous, and all the while the process of elimination went on, the timid and the feeble being sorted out, and only a rude race. All masculine, with brutish strength, to borrow Emerson's phrase, surviving to form families and the ranks of the samurai. Coming to profess great honor and great privileges, and correspondingly great responsibilities, they soon felt the need of a common standard of behavior, especially as they were always on a belligerent footing and belonged to different clans. Just as physicians limit competition among themselves by professional courtesy, just as lawyers sit in courts of honor in cases of violated etiquette, so must also warriors possess some resort for final judgment on their misdemeanors. Fair play in fight. What fertile germs of morality lie in this primitive sense of savagery and childhood? Is it not the root of all military and civic virtue? We smile, as if we had outgrown it. At the boyish desire of the small Britisher, Tom Brown, to leave behind him the name of a fellow who never bullied a little boy or turned his back on a big one. And yet, who does not know that this desire is the cornerstone on which moral structures of mighty dimensions can be reared? May I not go even so far as to say that the gentlest and most peace-loving of religions endorses this aspiration? The desire of Tom is the basis on which the greatness of England is largely built, and it will not take us long to discover that Bushido does not stand on a lesser pedestal. If fighting in itself, be it offensive or defensive, is, as Quakers rightly testify, brutal and wrong, we can still say with Lessing, we know from what failings our virtue springs. Sneaks and cowards are epithets of the worst opprobrium to healthy, simple natures. Childhood begins life with these notions, and knighthood also. But, as life grows larger and its relations many-sided, the early faith seeks sanction from higher authority in more rational sources for its own justification, satisfaction, and development. If military systems had operated alone, without higher moral support, how far short of chivalry would the ideal of knighthood have fallen? In Europe, Christianity, interpreted with concessions convenient to chivalry, infused it nevertheless with spiritual data. Religion, war, and glory were the three souls of a perfect Christian knight, says Lamartine. In Japan there were several sources of Bushido. Chapter 2. Sources of Bushido. I may begin with Buddhism. It furnished a sense of calm trust in fate, a quiet submission to the inevitable, that stoic composure in sight of danger or calamity, that disdain of life and friendliness with death. A foremost teacher of swordsmanship, when he saw his pupil master the utmost of his art, told him, "Beyond this my instruction must give way to Zen teaching." Zen is the Japanese equivalent for the dhyana, which represents human effort to reach through meditation zones of thought beyond the range of verbal expression. For its method is contemplation, and its purport, so far as I understand it, to be convinced of a principle that underlies all phenomena, and, if it can, of the Absolute itself, and thus to put oneself in harmony with this Absolute. Thus defined, the teaching was more than the dogma of a sect, and whoever attains to the perception of the Absolute raises himself above mundane things and awakes to a new heaven and a new earth. What Buddhism failed to give, Shintoism offered. In abundance. Such loyalty to the sovereign, such reverence for ancestral memory, and such filial piety as are not taught by any other creed, were inculcated by the Shinto doctrines, imparting passivity to the otherwise arrogant character of the samurai. Shinto theology has no place for the dogma of original sin. On the contrary, it believes in the innate goodness and godlike purity of the human soul, adoring it as the adytum from which divine oracles are proclaimed. Everybody has observed that the Shinto shrines are conspicuously devoid of objects and instruments of worship, and that a plain mirror hung in the sanctuary forms the essential part of its furnishing. The presence of this article is easy to explain. It typifies the human heart, which, when perfectly placid and clear, reflects the very image of the deity. When you stand, therefore, in front of the shrine to worship, you see your own image reflected on its shining surface, and the act of worship is tantamount to the old Delphic injunction, know thyself. But self-knowledge does not imply, either in the Greek or Japanese teaching, knowledge of the physical part of man, not his anatomy or his psychophysics. Knowledge was to be of a moral kind, the introspection of our moral nature. Mommsen, comparing the Greek and the Roman, says that when the former worshipped he raised his eyes to heaven, for his prayer was contemplation, while the latter veiled his head, for his was reflection. Essentially like the Roman conception of religion, our reflection brought into prominence not so much the moral as the national consciousness of the individual. Its nature worship endeared the country to our inmost souls, while its ancestor worship, tracing from lineage to lineage, made the imperial family the fountainhead of the whole nation. To us the country is more than land and soil from which to mine gold or to reap grain. It is the sacred abode of the gods, the spirits of our forefathers. To us the emperor is more than the arch-constable of a Reichsstadt, or even the patron of a Kulturstadt. He is the bodily representative of heaven on earth, blending in his person its power and its mercy. If what M. Boutme 5 says is true of English royalty, that it is not only the image of authority, but the author and symbol of national unity, as I believe it to be, doubly and trebly may this be affirmed of royalty in Japan. The tenets of Shintoism cover the two predominating features of the emotional life of our race, patriotism and loyalty. Arthur Maynap very truly says, in Hebrew literature it is often difficult to tell whether the writer is speaking of God or of the Commonwealth, of heaven or of Jerusalem, of the Messiah or of the nation itself. 6. A similar confusion may be noticed in the nomenclature of our national faith. I said confusion, because it will be so deemed by a logical intellect on account of its verbal ambiguity. Still, being a framework of national instinct and race feelings, it never pretends to systematic philosophy or a rational theology. This religion, or, is it not more correct to say, the race emotions which this religion expressed, thoroughly imbued Bushido with loyalty to the sovereign and love of country. These acted more as impulses than as doctrines. For Shintoism, unlike the medieval Christian Church, prescribed to its votaries scarcely any credenda, furnishing them at the same time with agenda of a straightforward and simple type. As to strictly ethical doctrines, the teachings of Confucius were the most prolific source of Bushido. His enunciation of the 5 moral relations between master and servant, the governing and the governed, father and son, husband and wife, older and younger brother, and between friend and friend, was but a confirmation of what the race instinct had recognized before his writings were introduced from China. The calm, benignant and worldly-wise character of his politico-ethical precepts was particularly well suited to the samurai, who formed the ruling class. His aristocratic and conservative tone was well adapted to the requirements of these warrior statesmen. Next to Confucius, Mencius exercised an immense authority over Bushido. His forcible and often quite democratic theories were exceedingly taking to sympathetic natures, and they were even thought dangerous to, and subversive of, the existing social order, hence his works were for a long time under censure. Still, the words of this mastermind found permanent lodgment in the heart of the samurai. The writings of Confucius and Mencius formed the principal textbooks for youths and the highest authority in discussion among the old. A mere acquaintance with the classics of these two sages was held, however, in no high esteem. A common proverb ridicules one who has only an intellectual knowledge of Confucius, as a man ever studious but ignorant of analects. A typical samurai calls a literary savant a book-smelling sot. Another compares learning to an ill-smelling vegetable that must be boiled and boiled before it is fit for use. A man who has read little smells a little pedantic, and a man who has read much smells yet more so, both are alike unpleasant. The writer meant thereby that knowledge becomes really such only when it is assimilated in the mind of the learner and shows in his character. An intellectual specialist was considered a machine. Intellect itself was considered subordinate to ethical emotion. Man and the universe were conceived to be alike spiritual and ethical. Bushido could not accept the judgment of Huxley, that the cosmic process was unmoral. Bushido made light of knowledge of such. It was not pursued as an end in itself, but as a means to the attainment of wisdom. Hence, he who stopped short of this end was regarded no higher than a convenient machine, which could turn out poems and maxims at bidding. Thus, knowledge was conceived as identical with its practical application in life. And this Socratic doctrine found its greatest exponent in the Chinese philosopher, Wan Yangming, who never wearies of repeating, to know and to act are one and the same. I beg leave for a moment's digression while I am on this subject, inasmuch as some of the noblest types of Bushi were strongly influenced by the teachings of this sage. Western readers will easily recognize in his writings many parallels to the New Testament. Making allowance for the terms peculiar to either teaching, the passage, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And all these things shall be added unto you," conveys a thought that may be found on almost any page of Wanyang Ming. A Japanese disciple 7 of his says, "The Lord of heaven and earth, of all living beings, dwelling in the heart of man, becomes his mind, kokoro. Hence a mind is a living thing, and is ever luminous, and again, the spiritual light of our essential being is pure, and is not affected by the will of man. Spontaneously springing up in our mind, it shows what is right and wrong, it is then called conscience, it is even the light that proceedeth from the God of heaven." How very much do these words sound like some passages from Isaac Pennington or other philosophic mystics. I am inclined to think that the Japanese mind, as expressed in the simple tenets of the Shinto religion, was particularly open to the reception of Yang Ming's precepts. He carried his doctrine of the infallibility of conscience to extreme transcendentalism, attributing to it the faculty to perceive, not only the distinction between right and wrong, but also the nature of psychical facts and physical phenomena. He went as far as, if not farther than, Berkeley and Fichte, in idealism, denying the existence of things outside of human ken. If his system had all the logical errors charged to solipsism, it had all the efficacy of strong conviction, and its moral import in developing individuality of character and equanimity of temper cannot be gainsaid. Thus, whatever the sources, the essential principles which Bushido imbibed from them and assimilated to itself, were few and simple. Few and simple as these were, they were sufficient to furnish a safe conduct of life even through the unsafest days of the most unsettled period of our nation's history. The wholesome unsophisticated nature of our warrior ancestors derived ample food for their spirit from a sheaf of commonplace and fragmentary teachings, gleaned as it were on the highways and byways of ancient thought, and, stimulated by the demands of the age, formed from these gleanings a new and unique type of manhood. An acute French savant, M. de la Mazelière, thus sums up his impressions of the 16th century: "Toward the middle of the 16th century, all is confusion in Japan, in the government, in society, in the church. But the civil wars, the manners returning to barbarism, the necessity for each to execute justice for himself, these formed men comparable to those Italians of the 16th century, in whom Taine praises the vigorous initiative, the habit of sudden resolutions and desperate undertakings, the grand capacity to do and to suffer. In Japan as in Italy, the rude manners of the Middle Ages made of man a superb animal, wholly militant and wholly resistant. And this is why the 16th century displays in the highest degree the principal quality of the Japanese race, that great diversity which one finds there between minds, esprits, as well as between temperaments. While in India and even in China men seem to differ chiefly in degree of energy or intelligence, in Japan they differ by originality of character as well. Now, individuality is the sign of superior races and of civilizations already developed. If we make use of an expression dear to Nietzsche, we might say that in Asia, to speak of humanity is to speak of its plains, in Japan as in Europe, one represents it above all by its mountains. To the pervading characteristics of the men of whom M. de la Mazelière writes, let us now address ourselves. I shall begin with rectitude. Chapter 3. Rectitude or Justice. Here we discern the most cogent precept in the code of the samurai. Nothing is more loathsome to him than underhand dealings and crooked undertakings. The conception of rectitude may be erroneous, it may be narrow. A well-known Bushi defines it as a power of resolution. Rectitude is the power of deciding upon a certain course of conduct in accordance with reason, without wavering, to die when it is right to die, to strike when to strike is right. Another speaks of it in the following terms: rectitude is the bone that gives firmness and stature. As without bones the head cannot rest on the top of the spine, nor hands move nor feet stand, so without rectitude neither talent nor learning can make of a human frame a samurai. With it the lack of accomplishments is as nothing. Mencius calls benevolence man's mind, and rectitude or righteousness his path. How lamentable, he exclaims, is it to neglect the path and not pursue it, to lose the mind and not know to seek it again. When men's fowls and dogs are lost, they know to seek for them again, but they lose their mind and do not know to seek for it. Have we not here, as in a glass darkly, a parable propounded 300 years later in another clime and by a greater teacher, who called himself the way of righteousness, through whom the lost could be found? But I stray from my point. Righteousness, according to Mencius, is a straight and narrow path which a man ought to take to regain the lost paradise. Even in the latter days of feudalism, when the long continuance of peace brought leisure into the life of the warrior class, and with it dissipations of all kinds and accomplishments of gentle arts, the epithet Gishi, a man of rectitude, was considered superior to any name that signified mastery of learning or art. The 47 faithfuls of whom so much is made in our popular education are known in common parlance as the 47 Gishi. In times when cunning artifice was liable to pass for military tact and downright falsehood for ruse de guerre, this manly virtue, frank and honest, was a jewel that shone the brightest and was most highly praised. Rectitude is a twin brother to valor, another martial virtue. But before proceeding to speak of valor, let me linger a little while on what I may term a derivation from rectitude, which, at first deviating slightly from its original, became more and more removed from it, until its meaning was perverted in a popular acceptance. I speak of giri, literally the right reason, but which came in time to mean a vague sense of duty which public opinion expects an incumbent to fulfill. In its original and unalloyed sense, it meant duty, pure and simple. Hence, we speak of the giri we owe to parents, to superiors, to inferiors, to society at large, and so forth. In these instances giri is duty. For what else is duty than what right reason demands and commands us to do? Should not right reason be our categorical imperative? Giri primarily meant no more than duty, and I dare say its etymology was derived from the fact, that in our conduct, say to our parents, though love should be the only motive, lacking that, there must be some other authority to enforce filial piety. And they formulated this authority in giri. Very rightly did they formulate this authority giri, since if love does not rush to deeds of virtue, recourse must be had to man's intellect and his reason must be quickened to convince him of the necessity of acting aright. The same is true of any other moral obligation. The instant duty becomes onerous, right reason steps in to prevent our shirking it. Giri thus understood is a severe taskmaster, with a birch rod in his hand to make sluggards perform their part. It is a secondary power in ethics. As a motive it is infinitely inferior to the Christian doctrine of love, which should be the law. I deem it a product of the conditions of an artificial society, of a society in which accident of birth and unmerited favor instituted class distinctions, in which the family was the social unit, in which seniority of age was of more account than superiority of talents, in which natural affections had often to succumb before arbitrary man-made customs. Because of this very artificiality, giri in time degenerated into a vague sense of propriety called up to explain this and sanction that, as, for example, why a mother must, if need be, sacrifice all her other children in order to save the firstborn. Or why a daughter must sell her chastity to get funds to pay for the father's dissipation, and the like. Starting as right reason, giri has, in my opinion, often stooped to casuistry. It has even degenerated into cowardly fear of censure. I might say of giri what Scott wrote of patriotism, that, as it is the fairest, so it is often the most suspicious, mask of other feelings. Carried beyond or below right reason, giri became a monstrous misnomer. It harbored under its wings every sort of sophistry and hypocrisy. It would have been easily turned into a nest of cowardice, if Bushido had not a keen and correct sense of courage, the spirit of daring and bearing. Chapter 4. Courage, the spirit of daring and bearing. Courage was scarcely deemed worthy to be counted among virtues, unless it was exercised in the cause of righteousness. In his Analects Confucius defines courage by explaining, as is often his wont, what its negative is. Perceiving what is right, he says, and doing it not, argues lack of courage. Put this epigram into a positive statement, and it runs, courage is doing what is right. To run all kinds of hazards, to jeopard one's self, to rush into the jaws of death, these are too often identified with valor, and in the profession of arms such rashness of conduct, what Shakespeare calls valor misbegot, is unjustly applauded. But not so in the precepts of knighthood. Death for a cause unworthy of dying for, was called a dog's death. To rush into the thick of battle and to be slain in it, says a prince of Medo, is easy enough, and the merest churl is equal to the task. But, he continues, it is true courage to live when it is right to live, and to die only when it is right to die, and yet the prince had not even heard of the name of Plato, who defines courage as the knowledge of things that a man should fear and that he should not fear. A distinction which is made in the West between moral and physical courage has long been recognized among us. What samurai youth has not heard of great valor and the valor of a villain? Valor, fortitude, bravery, fearlessness, courage, being the qualities of soul which appeal most easily to juvenile minds, and which can be trained by exercise and example, were, so to speak, the most popular virtues. Early emulated among the youth. Stories of military exploits were repeated almost before boys left their mother's breast. Does a little booby cry for any ache? The mother scolds him in this fashion, what a coward to cry for a trifling pain. What will you do when your arm is cut off in battle? What when you are called upon to commit harakiri? We all know the pathetic fortitude of a famished little boy prince of Sendai, who in the drama is made to say to his little page, sayest thou those tiny sparrows in the nest, how their yellow bills are opened wide, and now see. There comes their mother with worms to feed them. How eagerly and happily the little ones eat. But for a samurai, when his stomach is empty, it is a disgrace to feel hungry. Anecdotes of fortitude and bravery abound in nursery tales, though stories of this kind are not by any means the only method of early imbuing the spirit with daring and fearlessness. Parents, with sternness sometimes verging on cruelty, set their children to tasks that called forth all the pluck that was in them. Bears hurl their cubs down the gorge, they said. Samurai's sons were let down to steep valleys of hardship, and spurred to Sisyphus-like tasks. Occasional deprivation of food or exposure to cold, was considered a highly efficacious test for inuring them to endurance. Children of tender age were sent among utter strangers with some message to deliver, were made to rise before the sun, and before breakfast attend to their reading exercises, walking to their teachers with bare feet in the cold of winter. They frequently once or twice a month, as on the festival of a god of learning, came together in small groups and passed the night without sleep, in reading aloud by turns. Pilgrimages to all sorts of uncanny places, to execution grounds, to graveyards, to houses reputed of being haunted, were favorite pastimes of the young. In the days when decapitation was public, not only were small boys sent to witness the ghastly scene, but they were made to visit alone the place in the darkness of night and there to leave a mark of their visit on the trunkless head. Does this ultra-Spartan system of drilling the nerves strike the modern pedagogist with horror and doubt whether the tendency would not be brutalizing, nipping in the bud the tender emotions of the heart? Let us see in another chapter what other concepts Bushido had of valor. Chapter 5. Benevolence, the feeling of distress. Love, magnanimity, affection for others, sympathy and pity, were ever recognized to be supreme virtues, the highest of all the attributes of the human soul. It was deemed a princely virtue in a twofold sense, princely among the manifold attributes of a noble spirit, princely as particularly befitting a princely profession. We needed no Shakespeare to feel, though, perhaps, like the rest of the world, we needed him to express it, that mercy became a monarch better than his crown, that it was above his sceptred sway. How often both Confucius and Mencius repeat the highest requirement of a ruler of men to consist in benevolence. Confucius would say, let but a prince cultivate virtue, people will flock to him, with people will come to him lands. Lands will bring forth for him wealth, wealth will give him the benefit of right uses. Virtue is the root, and wealth an outcome. Again, never has there been a case of a sovereign loving benevolence, and the people not loving righteousness. Mencius follows close at his heels and says, instances are on record where individuals attain to supreme power in a single state, without benevolence, but never have I heard of a whole empire falling into the hands of one who lacked this virtue. Also, it is impossible that any one should become ruler of the people to whom they have not yielded the subjection of their hearts. Both define this indispensable requirement in a ruler by saying, benevolence is man. Under the regime of feudalism, which could easily degenerate into militarism, it was to benevolence that we owed our deliverance from despotism of the worst kind. An utter surrender of life and limb on the part of the governed would have left nothing for the governing but self-will, and this has for its natural consequence the growth of that absolutism so often called Oriental despotism. As though there were no despots of Occidental history. Let it be far from me to uphold despotism of any sort, but it is a mistake to identify feudalism with it. When Frederick the Great wrote that, "Kings are the first servants of the state," jurists thought rightly that a new era was reached in the development of freedom. Strangely coinciding in time, in the backwoods of northwestern Japan, Yozen of Yonezawa made exactly the same declaration, showing that feudalism was not all tyranny and oppression. A feudal prince, although unmindful of owing reciprocal obligations to his vassals, felt a higher sense of responsibility to his ancestors and to heaven. He was a father to his subjects, whom heaven entrusted to his care. According to the ancient Chinese book of poetry, until the house of Yin lost the hearts of the people, they could appear before heaven. And Confucius in his great learning taught, when the prince loves what the people love and hates what the people hate, then is he what is called the parent of the people. Thus are public opinion and monarchical will or democracy and absolutism merged one in the other. Thus also, in a sense not usually assigned to the term, Bushido accepted and corroborated paternal government, paternal also as opposed to the less interested avuncular government. Uncle Sam's, to wit. The difference between a despotic and a paternal government lies in this, that in the one the people obey reluctantly, while in the other they do so with that proud submission, that dignified obedience, that subordination of heart which kept alive, even in servitude itself, the spirit of exalted freedom. 9. The old saying is not entirely false which called the King of England the King of Devils, because of his subjects' often insurrections against, and depositions of, their princes, and which made the French monarch the King of Asses. Because of their infinite taxes and impositions, but which gave the title of the King of Men to the sovereign of Spain, because of his subjects' willing obedience. But enough. Virtue and absolute power may strike the Anglo-Saxon mind as terms which it is impossible to harmonize. Pobedonostsev has clearly set forth before us the contrast in the foundations of English and other European communities. Namely, that these were organized on the basis of common interest, while that was distinguished by a strongly developed independent personality. What this Russian statesman says of the personal dependence of individuals on some social alliance and in the end of ends on the state, among the continental nations of Europe and particularly among Slavonic peoples, is doubly true of the Japanese. Hence not only is a free exercise of monarchical power not felt as heavily by us as in Europe, but it is generally moderated by paternal consideration for the feelings of the people. Absolutism, says Bismarck, primarily demands in the ruler impartiality, honesty, devotion to duty, energy and inward humility. If I may be allowed to make one more quotation on this subject, I will cite from the speech of the German Emperor at Koblenz, in which he spoke of kingship, by the grace of God, with its heavy duties. Its tremendous responsibilities to the Creator alone, from which no man, no minister, no parliament, can release the monarch. We knew benevolence was a tender virtue and mother-like. If upright rectitude and stem justice were peculiarly masculine, mercy had the gentleness and the persuasiveness of a feminine nature. We were warned against indulging in indiscriminate charity, without seasoning it with justice and rectitude. Massimian expressed it well in his oft-quoted aphorism, rectitude carried to excess hardens into stiffness. Benevolence indulged beyond measure sinks into weakness. Fortunately mercy was not so rare as it was beautiful, for it is universally true that the bravest are the tenderest, the loving are the daring. Bushi no Nazake, the tenderness of a warrior had a sound which appealed at once to whatever was noble in us. Not that the mercy of a samurai was generically different from the mercy of any other being, but because it implied mercy where mercy was not a blind impulse, but where it recognized due regard to justice. And where mercy did not remain merely a certain state of mind, but where it was backed with power to save or kill. As economists speak of demand as being effectual or ineffectual, similarly we may call the mercy of Bushi effectual, since it implied the power of acting for the good or detriment of the recipient. Priding themselves as they did in their brute strength and privileges to turn it into account, the samurai gave full consent to what Mencius taught concerning the power of love. Benevolence, he says, brings under its sway whatever hinders its power, just as water subdues fire. They only doubt the power of water to quench flames who try to extinguish with a cupful a whole burning wagon load of faggots. He also says that the feeling of distress is the root of